Chapter 1. Silver Lies. Marienburg never slept. It merely changed masks. By night, the great city of canals and counting houses sweated rot and coin in equal measure. Lantern light smeared itself across black water like spilt oil, and the air tasted of salt, sewage, and ambition. Dieter van Kessel ran through it all, with the grace of a man who had done this too many times before. His boots slapped wet stone as he vaulted a collapsed bollard and skidded down a narrow quay, breath tearing at his lungs. Somewhere behind him, men shouted harsh, dock-born voices thick with anger and the promise of violence. Steel rang. A pistol barked, the shot cracking past his ear and shattering a lantern. Darkness rushed in, thick and choking. "Thief!" someone bellowed. "Get the bastard!" Dieter risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. 3 of them now broad-shouldered, leather-coated, faces red with fury. One carried a cudgel studded with nails. Another had a knife long enough to gut a horse. The third, worst of all, wore the badge of a minor merchant house, one of the smaller players. But small men were often the cruelest. It had all gone wrong so quickly. The artifact had been perfect, or so Dieter had thought. An elegant thing, all pale curves and whisper-thin runes, set in a lacquered case lined with velvet, recovered from a ruined tower in the grey mountains, he'd said, voice smooth as silk. Pure Ulthuan make, pre-sundering. He'd watched greed bloom in their eyes. Elven relics always did that. Men would believe anything if it came with a story old enough, but then the buyer's factor had brought in an elf, not some painted dockside curiosity or half-drunk exile, but a real one, tall, cold-eyed, dressed in layered silks and disdain. He'd taken one look at the artifact, sniffed, and pronounced it fake. Not even a good one. The runes were nonsense, the curves wrong, human hands pretending at immortality. The room had gone very quiet after that. Dieter had bolted through a window. Now he ran, lungs burning, heart hammering, knowing with a sick certainty that he'd misjudged his exit routes. Marienburg was a maze, but even mazes had dead ends. This was one of them. The alley narrowed sharply, hemmed in by leaning brick walls slick with moss and old piss. A rusted iron gate blocked the far end, chained and padlocked. No time, no chance. Dieter skidded to a halt, chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. He spun, back to the wall, knife already in his hand, small, narrow, meant for throats rather than fights. He was a liar, not a killer. That had always been the arrangement. The men slowed as they approached, spreading out, smiling. They knew he was trapped. "There he is," the badge-wearer said, voice thick with satisfaction. "Little Silvermouth." Dieter flashed a grin, all teeth and bravado. "Gentlemen," he said, forcing steadiness into his tone, "surely we can talk about this." The cudgel came down without warning. Pain exploded across his ribs, knocking the breath from him in a wet grunt. He collapsed to one knee, knife clattering away. Another blow caught his shoulder. Something cracked. He tasted blood. "Talk," the knife man sneered. "You talked plenty already." Boots thudded into his gut. Again. Dieter curled instinctively, arms over his head, the world shrinking to pain and the copper tang of his own mouth. He'd die here, in a piss-stinking alley, beaten to death over a lie that hadn't even been a good one. A fitting end, perhaps. Then the shadows moved. At first, Dieter thought it was the lantern light, flickering oddly, his vision swimming from the blows. But the darkness at the far end of the alley thickened, folding in on itself like cloth drawn tight. A shape emerged, not stepping into the light so much as dimming it. The men noticed, too. Their laughter faltered. "What in the hell's," one began. The figure stood tall and narrow, wrapped in robes that seemed to shimmer as if woven from smoke and starlight. A mask covered its face smooth, featureless silver save for a single, ever-shifting sigil etched where the mouth should be. It hurt to look at, like trying to read a word that kept rearranging itself. The cudgel man raised his weapon. "Oi, this doesn't concern." The figure lifted one gloved hand. The man froze, not stiffened, not stunned, froze. Mid-step, cudgel half raised, eyes wide and glassy. The others shouted, panic breaking through their bravado. But before they could move, the shadows surged. Dieter saw too much and too little at once. Darkness coiled like living things, mouths opening where mouths should not be. There were screams, brief, sharp, abruptly cut off. Something wet splashed his boots. Then it was quiet. The bodies lay twisted and broken, their faces locked in expressions of bewildered terror. No blood stained the walls. No sign of struggle remained, save the corpses themselves. The figure turned to Dieter. Up close, it smelled of cold metal and old parchment. The sigil on its mask rippled slowly, like a thought half-formed. "You are dying," it said. Its voice was layered, one tone speaking, others whispering just beneath, out of sync, male and female and neither. Dieter coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Funny," he rasped. "Doesn't feel optional." "Death is a crossroads," the figure replied. "You stand upon it. I offer a path." Dieter barked a laugh that turned into a wince. "You're a wizard, or a daemon, or I've finally taken one too many knocks to the head. All labels," the figure said mildly, "are lies we tell ourselves to feel safe." It knelt before him, impossibly graceful, and for the first time Dieter felt true fear, not the animal terror of being beaten, but something colder, intent. "You survive by words," the figure continued, "by half-truths, by stories, by shaping what others believe. You have made a life from lies." Dieter swallowed. "I prefer entrepreneur." The sigil on the mask twisted, almost amused. "I can make you more," it said. "I can make your lies true." From within its robes, the figure produced a small velvet pouch. It opened it with careful fingers and tipped the contents into its palm. A tongue, at least, Dieter thought distantly. Something that had once been one. It was forged entirely of silver, polished to a mirror sheen. Veins ran through it like filigree. It twitched faintly, as if alive. Dieter stared, horror crawling up his spine. That's not happening." "A gift," the figure said. "A refinement. Your voice will carry weight. Your words will shape the world around them." "And the cost?" Dieter demanded. The figure tilted its head. "You already pay it." The alley seemed to stretch, shadows lengthening, the air growing heavy. Dieter's thoughts raced. This was madness. Chaos touched insanity. Every sermon he'd half listened to in his youth screamed at him to refuse, to pray, to die clean. But the pain in his ribs throbbed. His breath came shallow and wet. He would not last the night. "Tell them you're a noble," the figure whispered, leaning closer. "And the gods will bow." Dieter laughed weakly. "I've done that before. Not like this." Silence hung between them. Dieter thought of the counting houses, the velvet-lined rooms, the looks on men's faces when he spoke, and they believed. He thought of dying nameless in an alley, another corpse for the canal. He made his choice. "Fine," he said hoarsely. "Do it." The figure's gloved hand closed around his jaw with iron strength. There was no time to scream. Agony exploded through Dieter's skull as the silver tongue was forced into his mouth. Teeth cracked. Something tore. He felt his own tongue severed, felt it followed by a rush of cold as the silver thing fused, sank, became part of him. He convulsed, choking on blood and metal. The world fractured into shards of light and sound. Words, thousands of them, flooded his mind, overlapping, contradicting, promising. Then it was over. Dieter collapsed, retching, silver glinting wetly between his teeth. His mouth burned. His thoughts felt rearranged. The figure rose. "It is done," Dieter spat. Something clinked on the stones, his old tongue, pale and useless. He stared at it, then up at the figure, hatred and awe warring in his gut. "What are you?" he croaked. The sigil on the mask spiraled. A possibility. The shadows peeled away, and the figure was gone. Footsteps echoed at the alley's mouth. Armored, disciplined, city watch. Dieter's heart lurched. He pushed himself upright, pain flaring, and turned as the guards rounded the corner, halberds leveled, faces hard. "There!" one shouted. "Stand fast!" Dieter raised his hands slowly. His mouth felt strange, heavy. He swallowed, tasting silver. "I am Dieter van Kessel," he began, and stopped. "No, that wouldn't do. I am Lord Dietrich von Kael," he said instead, voice ringing clear despite his injuries. "And you are gravely mistaken." The guards faltered. The world seemed to lean in, listening. "I was attacked," Dieter continued smoothly, confidence blooming like a drug, "by cutthroats, thieves. I demand you escort me to my estate at once." The guards exchanged glances. One frowned, another swallowed. "Yes, my lord," the first said finally, lowering his halberd. Dieter smiled, and the silver in his mouth gleamed in the lantern light. Somewhere, far away, something laughed. Chapter 2. The Grifter's Rise. Marienburg bent easily if you knew where to press. Dieter van Kessel learned that truth in the weeks that followed, as surely as he learned the weight of silver in his mouth. The city was a thing of levers and pulleys, guild charters, lineage scrolls, tariffs, favors owed and favors implied. Men believed in paper more than steel, and in names more than faces. Dieter had always known that. What he had not known was how hungry belief could be. The first time he tested it, he did so cautiously. He took rooms in a merchant hostel overlooking the Suedal canals, a place respectable enough to suggest money but transient enough to avoid questions. His ribs still ached where the cudgel had kissed them, and when he spoke too long, heat flared in his mouth like a coal pressed against flesh. The silver tongue gleamed when he caught sight of it in the mirror, too bright, too perfect, as if it reflected light that wasn't there. He told himself it was just pain, trauma, shock, lies, all of them. The merchant he chose was a minor fish oil baron, puffed up on recent profits and desperate for recognition. Dieter dressed the part-tailored coat, modest but tasteful rings, hair slicked back with imported oils. When he introduced himself as Lord Dietrich von Kael of Nordland extraction, the words slid from his mouth with unnatural smoothness. The man blinked once, twice, then his posture changed. Spine straightened, voice softened. "A pleasure, my lord," the merchant said, bowing just slightly too deep. Dieter felt it then, a pull. Not in his gut, but behind his eyes. The air seemed to thrum, as if the lie had struck a tuning fork in the world itself. His tongue grew warm, then hot, a pleasant heat that spread down his throat and into his chest. He smiled. Within an hour, he had secured a private dinner, a line of credit, and an invitation to a closed guild function. He walked out richer than he'd ever been in his life, heart pounding not with fear, but exhilaration. It worked. The city opened to him after that. He learned the limits quickly. Small lies worked best when dressed as truth. He could not claim to be emperor or elector, those words stuck in his throat like glass, but aristocracy, minor titles, distant lineage, those flowed freely. When pressed, details supplied themselves unbidden. Estates he'd never seen, ancestors he'd never imagined, feuds and favors that existed only because he said they did. People remembered them afterward. Dieter moved upward through Marienburg's shadow economy, like oil on water. Smuggling rings became discreet trading partnerships. Loan sharks became private financiers. Brothels turned into salons. He spoke, and men believed. He smiled, and women leaned closer, eyes glassy, breaths quickening, as if his words carried more than sound. The silver tongue grew warmer with each deception. By the end of the first month, Dieter hosted gatherings of his own lavish affairs in rented canal houses, where wine flowed and illusionists performed tricks Dieter himself had once scoffed at. Only now, when he gestured and spoke softly, the tricks became something else. A candle flame bent toward his hand as he described divine favor. A spilled goblet refilled itself when he promised abundance. A drunken guest's coughing fit vanished when Dieter murmured of health and vigor. Miracles? Someone whispered. Dieter laughed it off. Of course, he always laughed things off. But the words stuck, clinging to him like perfume. The first noblewoman came next. She was middle-aged, sharp-eyed, and deeply bored, married to a shipping magnate twice her age, who treated her like an accessory. Dieter met her at a masked ball, his face hidden behind lacquered porcelain, his voice rich and intimate. He told her he was a widower. He told her he was cursed. He told her he saw something special in her. Each lie slid easily into the next, stacking, reinforcing, becoming something heavier than falsehood. When they lay together in her private chambers, silk tangled around them, she clung to him like a drowning woman. His whispers made her shudder. When he spoke her name, it sounded truer than truth. Afterward, as she slept, Dieter caught sight of himself in her mirror. There was nothing there. The bed reflected, the candles, her body sprawled in satisfied exhaustion. But where Dieter should have been, there was only a blur, a smear of shadow that shifted when he moved. He stepped closer, heart hammering. The reflection did not follow. Dieter recoiled, breath ragged, and the image snapped back into place, his face pale, eyes wide, mouth slightly open to reveal a flash of silver. He told himself it was a trick of the light. He told himself many things. These days, Marienburg rewarded confidence, and Dieter grew fat on it. He hired muscle ex-soldiers, river thugs, men who knew when not to ask questions. He bought silence. He bought information. He spoke softly and watched rivals ruin themselves after a single conversation with him, turning on allies, confessing secrets, offering concessions they didn't remember making. Sometimes he didn't even mean to lie. Once, at a guild negotiation, he said, "You've already agreed to this," without thinking. The man across the table frowned, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "of course. I had forgotten." Dieter felt a rush of heat, so intense it made him dizzy. His tongue pulsed, veins glowing faintly beneath the polished surface. That night, he dreamed of mouths opening where eyes should be, tongues writhing like serpents, whispering bargains in voices he half recognized. He woke, drenched in sweat, sheets tangled around him like restraints, the taste of ink and metal thick on his tongue. The dreams didn't stop. They grew stranger. Kaleidoscopic visions of cities folding into themselves, of dice rolling endlessly across cosmic boards, of masks laughing without faces beneath them. Sometimes he saw the alley again, the masked figure, the sigil shifting, watching him with patient amusement. He began to avoid mirrors, but the city would not let him rest. His reputation spread. In taverns and counting houses, men spoke of Lord von Kael in lowered tones. A fixer, a miracle worker, a devil, some said, and paid him anyway. Dieter found himself invited into higher circles, merchant princes, minor nobility, even envoys from the Empire who cared less about truth than results. Each meeting fed the hunger. Listeners leaned forward when he spoke, eyes shining, breaths shallow. Words seemed to coil around them, slipping into ears and minds alike. Some laughed too hard. Others wept without knowing why. A few trembled, hands clutching at table edges as if the ground itself had shifted. Dieter told himself he was in control. Then came the dock riots. A tariff dispute turned violent, guild enforcers clashing with dock workers in the streets. Fires burned, blood ran into the canals. Dieter was summoned as a mediator, neutral, respected, persuasive. He stood atop a crate, the crowd roaring, fists raised, knives glinting. "Listen to me," he shouted. The words rang out, impossibly loud, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The mob stilled. "You don't want this," Dieter said, voice calm, measured. "You want justice. You want to be heard." As he spoke, the air shimmered. The crowd's anger twisted, reshaping itself into something colder, more focused. Men lowered weapons. Women sobbed openly. When he finished, they dispersed not peacefully, but obediently, as if the fight had simply ended. Dieter staggered afterward, nearly collapsing as heat surged through his skull. His tongue burned white-hot, pain and pleasure intertwined. For a moment, just a moment, he felt something else speaking through him. He reached into the canal and laughed hysterically. That night, the mirror showed him again. This time, the reflection smiled when he did not. Its mouth opened wider than should have been possible, silver glinting wetly, and whispered words he could not hear but somehow understood. More. Dieter smashed the mirror with his fist, glass slicing his knuckles. Blood dripped onto the floor, dark and real. He stared at it, grounding himself in the pain. "I'm still me," he muttered. The words felt thin. Marienburg crowned him in quiet ways. Contracts bent, rivals vanished, deals concluded themselves before he even arrived. The city listened to him now, leaned toward his voice like iron filings to a lodestone. And somewhere, deep beneath the canals and counting houses, something watched, something patient, something pleased. Dieter van Kessel rose higher than he ever dreamed, and with every lie, the distance between him and the ground grew farther, the fall more certain. But for now, the city was his, and it believed every word he said. Chapter 3. The Cult Beneath. Every empire casts a shadow. Marienburg's was long, damp, and riddled with teeth. Dieter learned that truth as he always did by following the money. Contracts vanished from under his nose. Ships were redirected at the last moment. Bribes he had already paid were returned, politely, with apologies and excuses that rang hollow. Someone was working against him with precision, not the blunt greed of a rival grifter, but the careful patience of a spider. The name surfaced in whispers first. Von Brecht, a merchant prince of middling stature, respected but not beloved, dealing primarily in dyes, silks, and speculative imports. A man with warehouses along the western canals and guards who never drank on duty. A man whose ledgers never quite added up. Dieter smiled when he heard the rumors. A rival meant leverage. He arranged an introduction through 3 intermediaries and a bribe disguised as a charitable donation. When Van Brecht finally agreed to meet, it was not in a counting house or wine hall, but in a warehouse with sealed windows and guards posted inside as well as out. Van Brecht himself was a tall, narrow man with ink-stained fingers and eyes too alert for comfort. He smiled often, but never with his eyes. "Lord von Kael," he said, inclining his head. "I've heard intriguing things." Dieter returned the gesture, tongue already warming. "Likewise, it seems we occupy similar waters." They spoke of trade routes and tariffs, of opportunities and risks, a dance Dieter knew well. But something felt wrong. His words slid easily enough, but the heat in his mouth pulsed with warning rather than pleasure. Van Brecht listened too closely, nodding not in agreement but recognition. Finally, the merchant leaned back. "You should come below," he said. Dieter blinked. "Below?" Van Brecht's smile widened just enough to show teeth. "The canals hide many things." The descent began through a rusted grate behind stacked crates of indigo dye. Stone steps spiraled downward, slick with algae and old runoff. The air grew colder, heavier, threaded with a smell Dieter couldn't place ozone and incense, metal and rot. Torches burned with unnatural colors along the walls, their flames shifting from blue to violet to sickly green. Symbols were carved into the stone, subtle enough that Dieter might have missed them once. Now they itched at his eyes, patterns that refused to stay still. They reached a cavern hollowed out beneath the canals, water dripping from the ceiling in slow, deliberate rhythm. A dozen figures waited there, merchants, dock bosses, smugglers' faces he recognized from ledgers and rumors alike. All wore masks of lacquered wood or beaten brass, each etched with spirals and eyes. At the center stood a shrine. It was not a statue so much as a suggestion of one, a twisting mass of stone and metal, riddled with lenses, mirrors, and crystal prisms that caught the torchlight and fractured it into impossible angles. Runes crawled across its surface like living things. Dieter felt his silver tongue throb painfully, heat spiking so sharply he bit down hard enough to taste blood and metal. Von Brecht turned to face him. "Welcome," he said softly, "to the true Marienburg." The cult began to chant. Low at first, a murmuring cadence that echoed off the stone. Words layered over words, meaning shifting as they were spoken. Dieter felt them brush against his thoughts, probing, tasting. He should have run. Instead, he smiled. "You've been siphoning my contracts," Dieter said lightly. "That's not polite." A ripple went through the gathered figures. Van Brecht watched him carefully. "You speak boldly," the merchant said, "for someone standing on sacred ground." Dieter spread his hands. "I've always found honesty disarms people." The lie slid free. The shrine answered. Light flared from its mirrors, bending inward toward Dieter. The chanting stuttered, then resumed, louder, more fervent. Van Brecht's eyes widened not with anger, but awe. "He feels it," someone whispered. "By the changer." Van Brecht dropped to one knee. The others followed. Dieter Frose, you misunderstand, he began, but the words tangled as the heat in his mouth surged. His tongue glimmered visibly now, veins glowing like molten silver. Van Brecht bowed his masked head. The voice, he said reverently. The living utterance. Dieter's heart hammered. This was dangerous. This was wrong. But fear had never stopped him before. He leaned into it. I am many things, Dieter said slowly, choosing each word with care. I am not your god. The cult shuddered. No, Van Brecht agreed eagerly. You are its herald. They showed him the ledgers next. Hidden accounts, smuggling routes masked as charity shipments, funds siphoned to shell guilds that existed only on paper. Dieter understood at once. This wasn't merely a crime ring. It was infrastructure, a machine designed to move wealth, influence, and information toward something unseen, toward the shrine. We feed the great architect, Van Brecht explained, voice trembling with devotion. Each scheme, each betrayal, each clever turn of fate, it all pleases him. Dieter nodded, pretending to understand, pretending he wasn't fighting the urge to scream. The heat in his tongue ebbed and flowed, responding to every deception, every half-truth he layered atop another. They asked him to speak. At first, he refused. Modesty, he claimed. Humility. The cult murmured approval. Then he relented. Dieter stood before the shrine, mirrors reflecting him from 1,000 angles. Some showed his face clearly. Others showed nothing at all. A few showed something else. A tall, twisting silhouette with too many mouths. He spoke. He spoke of change, of ambition, of the lie at the heart of every truth. The words came easily, building upon one another, weaving a tapestry of meaning that shifted even as it was spoken. The shrine pulsed with light, lenses rotating, shadows writhing. The cult wept openly. When Dieter finished, he nearly collapsed. The heat inside him was unbearable, like molten metal poured down his throat. Something inside him stirred, heavy and vast, as if his lies were filling a vessel that had no bottom. Van Brecht helped him to his feet, hands shaking. You will lead us, he said, through words, through schemes, through glorious deception. Dieter smiled thinly. Of course, over the weeks that followed, he played the part. He attended secret gatherings beneath the canals, spoke riddles and promises, and watched the cult twist themselves into knots trying to interpret his every utterance. They brought him gifts, coin, relics, flesh-bound tomes that whispered when opened. He accepted what he could use and left the rest. All the while, he skimmed their accounts, redirecting wealth through a web of false charities and phantom guilds. He was careful, subtle, a siphon, not a theft. But the cult noticed something else. Every time Dieter lied in their presence, the shrine reacted. Light bent, shadows deepened, the air thrummed with power, and Dieter changed. His tongue burned constantly now, a low, constant heat that flared whenever he spoke falsely. He began to feel hollow after long sessions, as if something had been drawn out of him. His dreams worsened visions of vast, turning wheels of laughter echoing through infinite corridors. One night, alone in his chambers, he tried to speak the truth aloud. I am afraid, he said. Pain lanced through his skull, sharp and punishing. His tongue burned white-hot, and the words twisted on his lips. I am prepared, he heard himself say instead. He doubled over, gasping. The cult's worship intensified. They knelt when he entered. They cut themselves to draw symbols in his wake. Van Brecht began referring to him not as an ally, but as a necessity. "You complete the circuit," the merchant said one night, eyes fever-bright. "When you speak, he listens." Dieter laughed hollowly. He could feel it now, something vast and patient pressing against the inside of his thoughts, growing heavier with every lie. Every deception fed it. Every bent truth poured more into the waiting dark. He had wanted power. He had wanted control. Now, standing beneath the canals of Marienburg, surrounded by worshippers and mirrors and whispers, Dieter Van Kessel understood the cost. The city was not the only thing listening anymore, and whatever he was feeding was very, very hungry. Chapter 4. The Truth That Burns. The first time Dieter tried to tell the truth, it nearly killed him. It happened in a counting house overlooking the Vlod Canal, its tall windows fogged with rain and river mist. The room smelled of ink, damp parchment, and fear. Van Brecht stood opposite him across a heavy oak table, flanked by two masked cult enforcers whose hands never strayed far from their knives. Ledgers lay open between them, pages dense with numbers and sigils that crawled when you stared too long. Van Brecht's eyes were bright, too bright. "You've been moving funds," the merchant said softly. "Small amounts, cleverly disguised, but not cleverly enough." Dieter felt the familiar warmth bloom in his mouth, the silver tongue stirring like a waking beast. Normally, this would have been easy. A lie, a half-smile, a deflection wrapped in charm. He could have talked Van Brecht into apologizing for the accusation, but something in the man's tone, reverent, almost hopeful, made Dieter hesitate. This isn't a negotiation, he realized. It's a test. Van Brecht leaned forward. "Are you stealing from us, voice?" The room seemed to constrict. The mirrors set into the walls, decorative affectations, Dieter had assumed caught the torchlight and bent it inward, focusing it on him. His reflection fractured across their surfaces, each image slightly different. In one, his eyes were too large. In another, his mouth stretched too wide. Dieter swallowed. For once, just once, he decided to tell the truth. "Yes," he said. The word barely left his lips before agony tore through him. It was as if a branding iron had been thrust into his mouth. White-hot pain lanced down his throat, into his chest, up through his skull. Dieter screamed, the sound warping, echoing with other voices layered beneath his own. He staggered back, crashing into a chair as blood poured from his mouth, sizzling faintly where it hit the floor. The silver tongue burned like a star. Van Brecht recoiled in shock. The enforcers shouted, knives half drawn. Dieter clawed at his face, eyes streaming, vision swimming. His reflection in the mirrors writhed, mouths opening in silent laughter. The pain receded as abruptly as it had come, leaving him gasping, shaking, slick with sweat. When he tried to speak again, the words twisted. "I misspoke," he heard himself say, voice smooth and calm despite the blood on his chin. "I meant that I am safeguarding the funds, improving efficiency." Van Brecht's expression softened instantly. Relief washed over his features, so profound it bordered on ecstasy. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me. I doubted." Dieter stared at him, horror blooming cold and sharp in his gut. He hadn't chosen those words. The truth burned. The lie flowed. After that, everything unraveled. Dieter tested it in private first, locking himself in his chambers and standing before a mirror he hadn't yet smashed. He focused on something small, harmless. "My name is Dieter Van Kessel," he said. Pain flared, not as intense as before, but sharp enough to make him gasp. His tongue throbbed, heat spiking. "My name is Lord Dietrich von Kael," he said instead, and relief flooded him like cool water. He laughed, then high, brittle, on the edge of hysteria. "No," he whispered, trying again. "I am afraid." The pain returned, harsher this time, sparks dancing at the edges of his vision. His knees buckled. "I am prepared," his voice corrected, layered with a faint echo that was not his own. He pressed his forehead to the mirror, breathing hard. The reflection did not mirror the movement precisely. Its eyes lagged a heartbeat behind his own. Sleep offered no refuge. The whispers began that very night. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that slithered through his dreams like eels through mud. Words without language, promises without meaning. He woke with his tongue aching, silver hot against his teeth, sheets soaked with sweat. Then the whispers grew clearer. Speak, shape, feed. Sometimes he dreamed he was standing before the shrine beneath the canals, speaking lies that became birds, flying outward in great flocks of ink-black wings. Sometimes he dreamed of mirrors stacked endlessly, each reflecting a version of him more wrong than the last, extra eyes blinking open along his jaw, mouths opening in his palms, silver veins crawling beneath his skin. He woke one morning to find bite marks on his pillow from his own teeth. During the day, the city pressed closer, tighter. People sought him out constantly, merchants, criminals, nobles, cultists. They craved his voice, leaned toward it, drank it in. The moment he opened his mouth, they stilled, expressions softening, eyes glazing, as if listening to a beloved song. Dieter began to lose track of what he'd said to whom. Lies stacked upon lies, not carefully constructed anymore, but spilling out in reflexive torrents. His voice sometimes echoed strangely in enclosed spaces, a half-second delay that carried a different inflection. Once, while berating a dock boss, he heard a second voice speak through him, finishing his sentence in a tone that was not his own. The man dropped to his knees, sobbing. Dieter fled the room and vomited into the canal. His body changed in small, horrifying ways. His eyes ached constantly, vision blurring at the edges. When he looked too long into mirrors or still water, his pupils stretched, becoming vertical slits for a breath, before snapping back. Veins of faint silver crept outward from the corners of his mouth, vanishing beneath his skin like roots. His tongue glimmered even in darkness now, casting faint reflections on his teeth when he breathed. The cult noticed. They always noticed. Van Brecht began watching him with a hunger that made Dieter's skin crawl. "You are opening," the merchant said reverently, "becoming what you were meant to be. I don't want this," Dieter tried to say. The pain came so fast it dropped him to one knee, vision exploding into prismatic shards. He tasted blood and copper and something older. "You are chosen," his voice said instead, calm and resonant. "I accept." Van Brecht wept openly. That was when Dieter knew he had to run. He planned his escape carefully, though planning itself had become treacherous. Any time he thought too clearly about his intentions, his thoughts felt crowded, as if something else leaned in close to listen. He told no one. He lied even to himself, telling himself he was merely traveling, expanding operations. The lies smoothed the way. On the night he fled, the city was shrouded in fog thick enough to swallow lantern light. Dieter moved through it like a ghost, cloak pulled tight, hood low. He avoided the main canals, slipping through service alleys and forgotten walkways only smugglers and thieves remembered. The whispers followed him. "Where do you think you're going?" He clenched his jaw, silver tongue burning softly. At the southern gate, the watch challenged him. "State your business." Dieter opened his mouth, intending to say, "I am just a man trying to leave." Pain lanced through him like a spear. "I am on urgent business for the guilds," he heard himself say instead. "Delay me at your peril." The guards stepped aside at once, pale and sweating. Beyond the gate, the road stretched into darkness, rutted and slick with mud. Dieter walked until the city lights faded behind him, until his legs shook and his breath came ragged. He did not stop. Somewhere along the road, he fell to his knees and screamed into the dirt, fists clenched, throat raw. "Let me go," he tried to say. The words burned to ash before they reached his lips. "Not yet," the whispers replied, warm and intimate. "You are still useful." Dieter dragged himself back to his feet and stumbled onward, leaving Marienborg behind him, a city of mirrors and mouths and lies. But even as the walls vanished into fog, he knew the truth. He had not escaped. He had only widened the distance between himself and the cage, and wherever he went, the silver tongue went with him, whispering softly in the dark, hungry for the next lie. Chapter 5. Masks and Madness. The village of Holthaus squatted at the edge of the marsh, like a wound that refused to heal. Its houses were low and hunched, timber frames warped by damp and age, roofs sagging beneath the weight of rot and old prayers. The air smelled of peat smoke, stagnant water, and fear baked deep into the soil. Shrines to Sigmar jutted from crossroads and doorways alike, crude iron hammers nailed to posts, candles guttering even in daylight, strips of parchment inked with prayers that bled when it rained. This was a place that burned things first and asked questions later. Dieter arrived at dusk, mud-caked boots and a borrowed cloak wrapped tight around his frame. He had shaved his beard and cut his hair short with a knife dulled by neglect. Over his fine clothes he wore rough-spun robes scavenged from a dead pilgrim on the road, stiff with dried blood. Around his neck hung a hammer amulet, heavy and cold. A mask? He felt naked, without his usual finery, stripped of the careful polish that had once defined him. Worse, the silver tongue seemed restless, heat pulsing in slow, irritated waves, as if offended by the pretense. The villagers watched him from behind, shutters and half-open doors. No one greeted him. No one smiled. Good, Dieter thought. Fear was easier to work with than curiosity. He stopped at the central square, little more than a churned patch of mud, dominated by a gallows that had seen recent use. The body was gone, but the rope still swayed faintly in the wind, creaking softly like a whispering throat. Dieter raised his hands slowly, palms outward, and spoke. "People of Holthaus," he began, pitching his voice into a rough, fervent cadence he'd heard from real preachers on the road. "I come bearing warnings and blessings in equal measure." The words slid out smoothly, but he felt the resistance immediately, a subtle tug, as though something were adjusting his phrasing before it left his mouth. "I have seen corruption," he continued. "I have smelled it. Chaos walks among you. That did it." Doors opened. Men gathered, clubs and farming tools in hand. Women clutched children and charms. Eyes gleamed with a mixture of terror and eager relief. Someone else had noticed. Someone else could name the fear. Dieter stepped fully into the role. He spoke of witchcraft and mutation, of false healers and secret signs. He described the enemy not with specifics but with suggestion, letting their imaginations do the work. The silver tongue burned pleasantly now, heat rolling through him as belief gathered like a storm cloud. They begged him to stay. By nightfall, he was housed in the village's only stone building, a half-ruined chapel with cracked walls, and a hammer sigil carved so deeply into the altar it split the stone. Dieter knelt before it with practiced reverence, head bowed, hands clasped. He felt nothing of Sigmar. The whispers coiled around his thoughts instead. Amused. "Good mask," they murmured. "Convincing." He ignored them and slept poorly, dreams crawling with fire and rope and mouths that sang hymns in voices not their own. The next days were a blur of sermons and confessions. Villagers came to him in ones and twos, voices hushed, eyes darting. Dieter listened patiently as they spoke of neighbors who stared too long, of livestock born wrong, of children who dreamed strange dreams. He nodded gravely, offered reassurance, and when necessary pointed gently toward scapegoats. Each accusation fed the frenzy. A midwife was dragged from her home at dawn, beaten bloody and chained to the square's post. Dieter stood before her, heart pounding, as the villagers screamed for judgment. "She bears the mark," he began, and then faltered. Something twisted in his mouth. "She bears the—" His tongue burned, searing pain lancing through his jaw. Burden of doubt. His voice finished, smooth and confident. "Which must be tested." The crowd roared approval. Dieter staggered back, sweat slicking his spine. That wasn't what he'd meant to say. He'd wanted her gone, dead, safer that way. But the silver tongue had redirected him. The test was fire. They bound a midwife and held a torch to her flesh. She screamed until her voice broke, the smell of burning skin thick in the air. When she didn't mutate, didn't sprout horns or boil into something monstrous, the crowd hesitated. Dieter felt the heat in his mouth flare, insistent. "She has been spared," his voice declared before he could stop it. For now, the chains were loosened. The midwife collapsed, sobbing. That night, Dieter vomited behind the chapel, bile and blood splashing into the mud. His reflection stared back at him from a puddle, eyes too bright, smile too wide. "Stop it," he whispered. The reflection did not move its lips. The madness crept in slowly after that. Illusions began slipping loose from his control. Shadows lingered where none should fall. Once, during a sermon, the hammer sigil above the altar wept molten iron that hissed when it struck the stone. The villagers fell to their knees in ecstasy, calling it a sign. Dieter fled the chapel and locked himself inside the sacristy, hands shaking. "I didn't do that," he muttered. "But you spoke," the whispers replied. On the fourth day, the witch hunters arrived. They rode in at dawn, 6 of them clad in blackened mail and wide-brimmed hats, pistols and blades hanging heavy at their sides. Their horses were scarred and mean-eyed. Each man bore brands of flame and iron, scars carved into flesh with devotional precision. These were not villagers playing at faith. These were professionals. The village erupted into chaos as they dismounted. The hunters ignored the noise, eyes sweeping the square, noses wrinkling as if they could smell corruption on the air. Their leader was a tall man, with a burned cheek and a metal cap where his ear should have been. He looked at Dieter once and smiled without humor. "Preacher," he said, "you stink of lies." The silver tongue flared, hot enough to make Dieter gasp. "I serve Sigmar," Dieter said automatically, and felt the words bend as they left him. "I hunt corruption." The hunter tilted his head. "Do you?" They took over within hours, questioned everyone, dug up bodies, burned charms. Their methods were brutal and efficient. Screams echoed through Holthouse as the gallows saw use again. ropes creaking under fresh weight. Dieter tried to leave. The moment he stepped toward the road, his feet locked in place, muscles seizing as pain tore through his skull. His mouth opened against his will. "I will stay," his voice said, "and aid you." The hunter's smile widened. That night, Dieter's illusions turned against him. The chapel doors slammed shut on their own. Candle flames twisted into hammer-shaped silhouettes that beat against the walls. Shadows peeled themselves free from corners, stretching and warping into crude mockeries of men and beasts. The witch hunters drew steel, shouting prayers as one of the shadows lunged, teeth gnashing. Dieter screamed for it to stop. It laughed in his voice. The fight was brief and vicious. Pistols roared, blowing chunks from walls and bodies alike. One hunter was dragged into the dark and torn apart, blood spraying across the altar in arterial arcs. Another burned alive when his own torch flared into a living thing and wrapped around him like a lover. Dieter cowered behind the altar, hands clamped over his ears, silver tongue blazing white-hot. "I didn't want this," he tried to shout. Pain ripped through him. "Then why did you say it?" When dawn came, the chapel was a ruin. Bodies lay scattered, limbs twisted at impossible angles. The survivors stared at Dieter with naked hatred and fear. The leader leveled his pistol at Dieter's face. "Damon," he snarled. Dieter felt the words rising again. Unstoppable. "I am not your enemy," his voice said gently. "I am your test." The hunter pulled the trigger. The pistol misfired. Dieter ran. He ran into the marsh, through sucking mud and thorn-choked reeds, laughter and screams echoing behind him. He did not look back. He did not stop until his lungs burned and his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed face first into the mire, silver tongue whispering softly, lovingly, shaping words he had not yet spoken. Holthaus burned behind him, and Dieter von Kessel understood at last. He no longer wore the mask wore him. Chapter 6. The Architect's Game. Dieter did not remember falling. One moment he was running lungs aflame, boots tearing free of sucking marsh mud, the night alive with fire and screams behind him, and the next, the world tilted sideways and folded in on itself. The reeds became claws. The fog hardened into glass. Pain bloomed at the back of his skull, bright and intimate. When he woke, he was bound. Iron bands locked his wrists and ankles, etched with sigils that crawled when he tried to focus on them. Each movement sent needles of pain through his limbs, not from the restraints themselves, but from inside, as if his body no longer fully agreed with the shape it was forced to keep. The silver tongue lay heavy and hot in his mouth, pulsing in slow, measured beats, like a second heart. The man sitting across from him smiled. He was wrapped in layered robes, the color of bruised flesh and old parchment, their hems embroidered with symbols that refused to stay still. His face was narrow and ageless, eyes mismatched, one dark, one pale and luminous, both far too knowing. A staff rested across his knees, topped with a wheel of interlocking rings that turned without wind. "Awake already?" the man said pleasantly. "Excellent. I hate repeating myself." Dieter tried to speak. The pain was immediate, sharp enough to steal his breath. His tongue burned, forcing the words to twist. "Who are you?" came out as, "You found me." The prophet chuckled. "Yes, you shine like a beacon. Lies tend to do that. Once they reach critical mass, they traveled for days or perhaps moments. Time slipped its leash somewhere along the way. The landscape around them changed without warning. Marsh to ash plain to frozen forest, forest to broken stone. Dieter drifted in and out of consciousness, plagued by visions that bled into waking moments, mirrors that screamed when shattered, mouths blooming in the earth, threads of light tying his limbs to unseen hands. When they arrived, Dieter wept. The temple rose from a canyon of fractured rock, its geometry wrong in ways that made his eyes ache. Towers spiraled inward instead of up. Stairways led nowhere or folded back into themselves. The stone was veined with crystal that glowed faintly, refracting reality into overlapping angles. Sigils were carved everywhere, on walls, on floors, on the very air, layered atop one another in palimpsests of devotion and blasphemy. "This place was forgotten," the prophet said as they crossed a bridge that did not cast a shadow. Which is to say, it was abandoned, a crucial distinction. They dragged Dieter into the heart of the structure, into a vast chamber whose floor was covered by a mosaic so immense it defied comprehension. Tiles of glass, bone, gold, and flesh depicted scenes that shifted as he looked at them: battles, coronations, betrayals, births, deaths. Some showed Dieter himself in countless guises. Their restraints were removed. Dieter collapsed to his knees, retching. The floor was warm beneath his palms, pulsing faintly. He realized with a sick lurch that some of the tiles were alive. "Behold," the prophet intoned, spreading his arms. "The architect's ledger." The mosaic changed. Dieter saw himself standing at the center of a ritual circle, his body split open to house something vast and radiant, mouths pouring from his chest like spilled jewels. He saw himself crowned in silver, armies kneeling, cities burning at a word. He saw himself screaming as his soul fractured into 1,000 shards, each devoured by a different future. He saw himself as nothing at all. "No," Dieter whispered, and the pain lanced, forcing the word into a scream. The prophet knelt beside him, voice gentle. "Oh, yes, this is where all your paths converge. You were never running away. You were running toward." Dieter's reflection rose from the mosaic. It peeled itself free of the tiles, like wet paper, standing upright before him. The thing wore his face only as an approximation, its mouth split into dozens, tongues writhing and whispering, eyes opening and closing across its skin in no pattern Dieter could follow. Each mouth spoke a different lie, a different promise. "This is you?" they chorused. Dieter clutched his head, nails digging into his scalp. "I didn't ask for this." The reflection laughed, a sound like glass breaking in water. "You asked every time you opened your mouth." The prophet watched with rapt attention. "Beautiful, isn't it? A nascent host, so much potential, so much voice." Dieter looked up at him, terror curdling into something harder, sharper. "You brought me here to finish it," Dieter said, or tried to turn me into that. The words burned, twisted. "You brought me here," his voice corrected, steady and calm, "to offer terms." The prophet's smile widened. "Yes," he said softly, "that too." Dieter felt the pressure then, not physical, but absolute. Fate bearing down on him like a grinding wheel. The mosaic beneath him spun, futures shattering and reforming, each one worse than the last. He saw himself kneeling, enthroned, devoured, worshipped, discarded, a pawn. "No," Dieter growled, forcing the word through clenched teeth, through fire and agony. "I don't accept that." The prophet's eyes gleamed. "You dare bargain?" Dieter laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Bargaining is all I've ever done." He dragged himself to his feet, swaying. Blood dripped from his mouth, sizzling faintly where it struck the living tiles. He met the prophet's gaze, and felt the vast attention behind it, the weight of something ancient and amused. "I wager," Dieter said slowly, choosing each word like a blade, "that I can lie to fate itself." The temple shuddered, the mosaic flared, tiles cracking, images blurring. The reflections screamed, not in pain, but rage. The prophet inhaled sharply. Reverent, how deliciously arrogant. Dieter pressed on, pain tearing at him with every syllable. "You see all possible futures. You plan for every outcome, but you expect certain moves, certain shapes." He smiled, blood and silver gleaming together. "I specialize in the unexpected." The pressure intensified, crushing, testing. Visions slammed into him of daemonhood, of eternal servitude, of dissolution into raw concept and sound. Through it all, the whispers urged him to yield, to accept the crown of mouths. Dieter refused. "I will serve," he said, and the pain flared as the lie formed. "When it benefits me." The prophet froze. The architect's attention shifted. Dieter felt it like a finger tapping his skull, curious, amused, considering. The futures in the mosaic blurred, some dimming, others brightening. At last, laughter echoed through the chamber, vast, layered, impossible to locate. The prophet bowed deeply. "Very well, little liar, play the game." The restraints snapped back into place, not to bind but to anchor. The reflection was dragged screaming back into the mosaic, its mouths biting and gnashing as it dissolved into tile and symbol. Dieter collapsed, sobbing, smoke rising from his tongue. "Run," the prophet whispered into his ear. "Scheme, deceive. Every lie you tell will move the board." Dieter looked up, eyes wild. "And when I lose?" The prophet's smile was all teeth. "Then you will finally understand what you are." The temple dissolved around him, stone folding into light, light into darkness. Dieter Van Kessel fell again, this time into the world. He landed hard on cold earth beneath an open sky, lungs screaming, body shaking. The silver tongue lay heavy and quiet for the first time in days. But in his mind's eye, he saw the mosaic still turning. The game had begun, and somewhere beyond sight and sense, the architect watched, patient and pleased, as its favorite piece staggered back onto the board. Chapter 7. Grift of the Gods. The wastes did not welcome pilgrims. They tolerated them briefly, cruelly, as one tolerated vermin before the fire came. The land itself seemed to resent the shape of Dieter Van Kessel as he crossed it, ash crunching beneath his boots, the sky above bruised purple and green like rotting flesh. Winds howled with voices that were almost words. The ground pulsed faintly, as though something vast lay sleeping just beneath the crust. Dieter walked anyway. Every step hurt. His body bore the cost of his bargain in subtle, compounding ways, joints stiffening at odd angles, veins of silver webbing faintly beneath his skin, his shadow lagging a heartbeat behind his movements. The silver tongue lay quiet, but alert, warm as a loaded pistol behind his teeth. He followed rumors. He always had. A conclave of sorcerers, they said, 9 of them, disciples, rivals, prophets, madmen. They had gathered to enact a great working something meant to draw down a shard of divine favor, to anoint one among them as chosen. The ritual site lay at the heart of a ruined city swallowed by the wastes, its towers bent inward like supplicants. Dieter smiled as the city came into view. 9, a sacred number, a dangerous one. He did not approach openly. Instead, he circled the ruins for 2 days, watching from broken spires and half-buried streets. He listened to the arguments carried on, the wind voices raised in accusation, laughter edged with hysteria. He watched spells flare and gutter, familiars tear at one another in mid-air, apprentices die screaming when they stood too close to their master's ambitions. They hated one another. Perfect. On the third night, Dieter made his entrance. He did not walk into the ritual circle. He appeared. One moment the sorcerers were chanting, staffs raised, sigils blazing in the air like burning script, and the next, Dieter stood at the center of their formation, unharmed, hands clasped behind his back. The shock was delicious. Spells faltered. Words died in throats. Raw magic snarled and recoiled, as if uncertain how to touch him. Dieter inclined his head slightly. "You're late," he said, and felt the silver tongue flare, bright and eager. "I was beginning to think you'd failed." The lie struck like a hammer, reality bent. The sorcerers froze, each suddenly assaulted by the same impossible certainty that yes, someone had been expected, that this man, bleeding and battered though he looked, belonged here. One of them, a towering brute wrapped in iron plates, etched with runes, roared and hurled a bolt of warp fire. It curved. The spell bent away from Dieter at the last instant, slamming into another sorcerer and reducing him to shrieking ash. The circle erupted into chaos as wards flared and counterspells screamed into being. Dieter did not move. "You see," he said calmly, stepping forward as bodies burned, still squabbling, still blind. His voice echoed not just in the air, but inside them. Each sorcerer heard it slightly differently, a mentor's rebuke, a prophecy fulfilled, a rival's mocking tone. Dieter felt the strain immediately, the silver tongue blazing so hot he tasted smoke. He pressed on. "I am the convergence," he said, "the one your visions circled but could not name." Illusions bloomed around him unbidden. Crowns of shifting metal hovered above his head. Wings of refracted light unfurled, each feather etched with runes that crawled and rearranged themselves. His shadow split into 9 overlapping silhouettes, each reflecting a different destiny. The sorcerers fell silent. One knelt, then another. Not all of them, but enough. The iron-clad brute snarled, eyes blazing. "Lies," he spat. "No, chosen comes unannounced." Dieter turned to him slowly. "And yet," he said, "here I am." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ask yourself, why hasn't the ritual claimed you yet?" The brute hesitated, just for a moment. That moment was enough. Dieter reached into the storm of prophecy swirling above the circle, grasping threads only he could see. Futures overlapped here, knotting and fraying as the ritual strained toward completion. He tugged gently, lying with exquisite precision. "You will betray them," Dieter said softly to one sorcerer, then another, each hearing a different name. "You already have." Paranoia detonated. Accusations flew. Spells lashed out. One sorcerer screamed as his familiar tore out his throat. Another vanished in a flash of light, reappearing fused halfway into a pillar. The ritual circle cracked, sigils distorting, feeding back into themselves. Dieter laughed, a sharp, wild sound torn from his chest. The silver tongue sang. He felt it then, not just heat, but guidance. Words lining up in his mind before he thought them. Gestures suggesting themselves, lies arranging into a structure so vast it felt like architecture. He was no longer improvising. He was conducting. "Kill him!" one of the sorcerers shrieked, pointing at a rival. "He's sabotaging it." "No, she is," another howled, hurling a spell that peeled flesh from bone. Dieter stepped aside as the ritual imploded into blood and fire. He spoke constantly now, voice echoing with harmonics not meant for mortal throats. His words twisted prophecy, nudging outcomes, accelerating collapse. The ritual still sought completion. Warp energy spiraled inward, searching for an anchor. Dieter spread his arms. "Enough," he said. The word hit like a thunderclap. The surviving sorcerers fell to their knees, gasping, eyes bleeding. Above them, the storm of magic convulsed, collapsing inward toward Dieter in a screaming vortex of light and shadow. For a heartbeat, Dieter saw it again, the mosaic, the futures branching and dying, the writhing thing he would become if he failed. He lied. "I accept the burden," he declared. The silver tongue burned so fiercely he thought his skull would split. Veins of light raced across his skin, shadows writhing beneath it. The vortex slammed into him and slid past. Warp energy tore through the ritual circle, annihilating it, ripping the remaining sorcerers apart in fountains of blood and screaming souls. The city shook, towers collapsing as the magic dispersed violently into the wastes. Dieter was thrown clear, crashing through a shattered wall into the dust beyond. He lay there, coughing blood, body spasming as the silver tongue dimmed from white-hot to a dull, aching glow. Silence fell, then laughter. Not the prophets, not the whispers. Something deeper, broader, amused. The sky above twisted, clouds forming impossible spirals. For an instant, just an instant, Dieter felt a presence lean close, vast and curious, peering down at him like a child examining a clever insect. "Well played," it seemed to say. Dieter laughed weakly, half delirious. "You knew," he croaked. "You knew I'd do that." The laughter rippled, delighted. "Of course." The ruins burned behind him, soaked in blood and broken prophecy. Dieter dragged himself to his feet, every nerve screaming, but alive, still himself. For now, he had deceived sorcerers. He had warped ritual and fate alike. He had stolen a victory from the jaws of damnation. And somewhere beyond time and form, the changer of ways laughed not in mockery, but approval. The game continued, and Dieter van Kessel, liar extraordinaire, had just made his boldest move yet. Chapter 8. The final lie. The ritual did not end. It never truly did. It unraveled. Dieter felt it hours after the city of broken towers vanished behind him, after the blood dried in the cracks of his skin, and the laughter of the architect faded to a distant pressure behind his thoughts. The magic he had twisted and deflected had not dispersed cleanly. It clung. It followed. Threads of unreality snagged on his shadow, trailing after him like entrails pulled from a still-living body. He walked for days through wasteland and ruin, pursued by echoes. Sometimes the ground split beneath his feet, disgorging fragments of the ritual circle, burning sigils, screaming faces, shards of prophecy that tried to crawl back into him. Sometimes the sky inverted itself, showing him reflections of futures that had not yet died. He saw himself crowned. He saw himself devoured. He saw himself kneeling, mouth open, voice pouring out until there was nothing left inside. Each vision pulled at him. Each one tried to complete him. The silver tongue grew heavier with every mile, dragging at his jaw, its heat no longer sharp but constant, oppressive. It whispered not commands now, but reminders. You are Dieter von Kessel. You are the liar from Marienburg. You are the voice. He screamed for it to stop, but the words twisted into laughter halfway out of his mouth. By the time he reached the edge of the wastes, Dieter was barely coherent. His boots were gone. His cloak had fused to his shoulders in places, skin and cloth indistinguishable. His reflection when he dared glance into water no longer settled into one shape. Sometimes he had too many eyes, sometimes none. Sometimes his mouth moved when he did not speak. The ritual caught up to him at the crossroads. It manifested not as light or fire, but as certainty. The world stilled. Wind died. Dust hung motionless in the air. Dieter found himself standing on a road that forked endlessly, each path stretching into a different version of the world. On one road, banners snapped and armies marched at his word. On another, he was bound into a temple floor, mouth stretched wide as worship poured through him. On another still, he walked alone, forgotten, immortal, and empty. At the center of it all stood the mosaic, not beneath his feet this time, but inside his head. Tiles clicked into place behind his eyes, futures slotting together with obscene precision. The pressure returned, immense and patient. This was not a test, this was collection. Enough, the architect seemed to murmur. The piece has moved far enough. Dieter dropped to his knees, clawing at his face. His fingers came away slick with blood and silver. His mouth stretched open in a silent scream, tongues writhing in his vision, dozens of them, hundreds, each one bearing a voice he recognized. Victims, lovers, mocks, cultists, sorcerers, all of them speaking through him. No, he croaked. The word burned, but not as it once had. The pain was distant now, muted by something worse. You don't get to finish me. The laughter returned, not loud, not cruel, indulgent. You finished yourself. The mosaic showed him the truth at last. Not a future, a present. He saw what he had become beneath skin and name. A writhing knot of voices and mouths, bound together by lies. His soul stretched thin across 1,000 contradictions. He was already a vessel, already a conduit, already useful. All that remained was to seal it, to make him permanent. Dieter understood then what the architect had overlooked. It did not expect refusal, not refusal of power, not resistance, refusal of self. He had spent his life pretending to be others, nobles, prophets, saints, monsters. Every lie had layered over the man beneath until the truth of Dieter Van Kessel was little more than a rumor, and rumors could be erased. The silver tongue whispered urgently now, frantic, sensing danger. Remember who you are. Dieter laughed, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. That's the problem, he said softly. I don't want to. He closed his eyes and told the final lie. He did not speak it aloud. He spoke it inward. He lied about his childhood, the docks, the hunger, the first small scams that taught him words were sharper than knives. He lied about his name, his face, the feel of Marienburg's fog on his skin. He lied about the fear that had driven him, the ambition that had hollowed him out long before chaos ever touched him. He told himself none of it mattered. He told himself it had never existed. The pain was absolute, not burning this time, but erasing. Memories tore free like teeth, ripped from a skull. Faces blurred, names dissolved. The mosaic inside him shattered, tiles falling away into nothingness. The architect recoiled. For the first time, Dieter felt genuine surprise ripple through that vast, watching presence. What are you doing? Dieter smiled, a small, sad thing. Lying, he whispered. The silver tongue screamed. Veins of light erupted across his body, shadows tearing free and howling as they were stripped of anchor. The ritual collapsed inward, starved of its final component. Futures withered and died, branching paths snapping like dry twigs. Dieter Van Kessel ceased to exist. When the dust settled, the crossroads were gone. The road was gone. Only a man remained kneeling in the dirt, gasping, clutching his chest as if expecting to find a hole there. He looked ordinary, too ordinary. The silver tongue still rested in his mouth, dull and tarnished now, its surface cracked. It no longer whispered. It no longer burned. It was simply there. The man rose unsteadily to his feet. He looked around as if seeing the world for the first time. "What's your name?" a voice asked behind him. He turned. A traveler stood there, wrapped in a patched cloak, eyes wary. A normal man, a normal question. The man with the silver tongue opened his mouth. For a heartbeat, nothing came. Then he smiled. "I don't know," he said. The words landed softly, without pain, without echo. The traveler frowned, then shrugged and moved on. The man stood alone beneath a sky that did not twist or laugh. He walked. Years passed, decades, centuries, perhaps. The man wandered from city to city, kingdom to kingdom. He took names as easily as coats, wearing them until they frayed, discarding them without sentiment. Sometimes he was a merchant, sometimes a preacher, sometimes a thief, sometimes a hero spoken of in taverns in half-remembered tones. He did not age. Steel pierced him and slid free. Fire burned him and left scars that faded. Magic bent around him, uncertain, as if unsure what story he belonged to. People listened when he spoke. They always had. Sometimes, late at night, he felt a pressure behind his eyes, a sense of being observed. Sometimes laughter echoed at the edge of hearing, distant and fond, but the whispers never returned. If he was a puppet, his strings were slack. If he was a man, he no longer remembered being one. And somewhere beyond time and truth, the architect of fate watched its favorite paradox wander the world, neither victory nor failure, but something far more interesting, a lie that refused to end, a story without an author. And if anyone ever asked who he truly was, the answer, whatever it happened to be, was always convincing, because he believed it himself.